I'd like to call on Ken Capstick, Treasurer of the Socialist Labour Party. Ken's a former Vice President of the Yorkshire NUM and a former editor of the NUM journal, The Miner. And I suppose you'd expect a Yorkshire miner to, with typical bluntness, address his question, austerity, a capitalist crime. Ken.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Austerity is a capitalist crime, and it manifests itself very much so in the European Union. Today, I want to make the case for that charge and to make it stick. Today, I'm going to talk about the global economic crash of 2007 and 8 and the austerity being imposed as a consequence of it, and why austerity is a capitalist crime and a crime of the European troika of unelected bankers. The crash and its effects have not gone away. They are still with us today. And I don't know about you, but to say this was the most serious event to have happened in 100 years or more, I have not seen one single documentary on the BBC, ITV, Sky News, or any other of our media outlets to explain to our people what happened and why it happened and why they are suffering so much as a result of it. Not one. I want to talk about who caused the crash, how they caused it, and who is to blame for it, and how they got clean away with it and sailed off into the sunset on their yachts because we were told they were too big to fail and too big to jail. Now, I don't call this economic crisis that we are passing through a recession. And the reason I don't call it a recession is because it did not come about as a result of the normal ups and downs of the trade cycle. This crash was caused by the most prolific serial economic terrorists the world has ever known. And they continue to reign supreme. Normally they are referred to as bankers, financiers, traders in the City of London, or on Wall Street, or collectively, they describe themselves as the high priests of capitalism. I describe them as criminals. While ordinary people suffer the effects of austerity, these criminals remain at large and have turned themselves from millionaires into billionaires. They actually call themselves masters of the universe. This worldwide economic crash was caused by a cocktail of robbery, grand larceny, fraud, embezzlement, false accounting on a massive scale, obscene tax avoidance and evasion, and an unprecedented transfer of wealth and power from the poorest in society to the richest. The seeds of the economic crash were sown 37 years ago. when they were given free rein, totally unhindered by legislation or law during the Thatcher Regan years. If you trace back the cause of this crisis we are going through, it has to land. It has to land at the desk of those two people. They allowed the bankers and the financiers to run riot through the global economy like a plague of locusts, gobbling up the wealth of the world in an orgy of greed unprecedented in the history of this planet. We were told that if the rich got ever richer, it was good for us all, because there would be such a thing as trickle down. We might get a few crumbs from the banquet taking place above our heads. Well, today we can see the results of the crisis. Recently, I was in a debate with a guy on radio, and he said, we don't want to go back to the 1970s. I said, I do. I do. We had decent wages. We had decent pension schemes. All gone. No such thing as 0 hours contracts. The world is a much worse place as a result of what has taken place. Governments across the world, led by right-wing politicians and disciples of right-wing neoliberal dogma, led us all to the very edge of global systemic oblivion. And it is gearing up to happen all over again. Little has been done to stop it from happening again. Regulators with no teeth fell asleep at the wheel or were just as corrupt as the bankers and financiers themselves. These criminals have gone unpunished. They have been charged with no crime. Note the recent events, for instance, at HSBC Bank in the past few years. Only a few years ago, this bank was exposed for helping its rich clients to evade and avoid tax when they were facing possible prosecution. HSBC threatened to up sticks from London and go to Hong Kong. All of a sudden, out of the blue, they decided to stay. The bank levy, which taxes bank loans, was massively reduced by George Osborne, the then Chancellor, which contrasts with the austerity he imposed on everyone else. It might appear to you that the government caved in to the banks, and in particular HSBC. You might ask, certainly Arthur might ask, why are there no accusations of blackmail, holding the country to ransom, bringing the country to its knees, accusing the banks of being the enemy within? We never hear anything of that kind for the biggest criminals that the planet has ever seen. HSBC is a bank that in 2012 was found guilty of money laundering for drug cartels. Found guilty and fined $1.9 billion. But no one went to jail. All these economic thugs, because that is what they are, remain at large to carry on doing as they wish and enjoying the proceeds of their crimes. They are protected and shielded by political elites in the capitals of the world, and none more than in the European Union, with its enshrined doctrine of commitment to the capitalist system and to free markets. Now the very poorest in our societies across Europe are all called upon to be latter-day ragged-trousered philanthropists to rescue the global economy. This crisis is being used as an excuse to attack the things we hold dear: the welfare state, education, the NHS, which the Tories have always hated ideologically, while the poor are made to suffer austerity. These criminals are still at liberty to indulge in mis-selling, LIBOR rate fixing, foreign exchange manipulation, money laundering for drug cartels, and helping their rich clients to avoid and evade paying tax. So what caused the crash of 2007 and 2008? Well, if you really want to know, don't bother switching on the BBC. Like all those with a gambling addiction, the bankers and financiers and their whiz-kid mathematicians thought that they had found the Holy Grail and had eliminated risk from the system. But in fact, they had created a gigantic pyramid Ponzi scheme based on what they preferred to call innovation. These highly complicated schemes were deliberately designed to be as mysterious to understand as possible, and even many bankers and regulators themselves could not understand them. They gave their schemes really elaborate names like credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations, credit default obligations, asset-backed securities. But basically, they were Ponzi schemes, doomed at some point to fold like a pack of cards after the few who invented them had become extremely rich. One thing that keeps these criminals awake at night are the debtors they have on their balance sheets. After all, they are actually in the business of loaning money. That's what they do. And that is what they worry about. They were always looking for the Holy Grail, something to relieve them of the risk their loans represented. The thing about debtors that many people find difficult to understand, when I was doing a bookkeeping course, I found it very difficult to grasp this concept, but I grasp it now. The thing about debtors, as any bookkeeper or accountant will tell you, is that they are regarded as assets on a balance sheet, as long as there is some prospect that the debts will be repaid. So if you think about, let's say, a simple example, you have £1,000 in your bank and you lend £100 to your friend. You might think, well, I've only got £900 left. But a bookkeeper or accountant would say, no, you haven't. You've got £900 in your bank and you've got £100 with your friend. So you're still worth £1,000. That's what worries the banks. Because let's assume that your friend ends up under the proverbial number 9 bus. Then it's no longer an asset. Overnight, it's become a massive liability. And that's what the bankers were worried about, because they were lending money all over the place in the subprime mortgage market in America. They'd invented something called credit default swaps. And basically they were a dodgy insurance scheme. They would give a premium to other financial institutions, pension schemes, insurers, other banks, to insure against the debtors on their balance sheets from collapsing and being unable to pay. There were people quite happy to do that because they thought, well, it would take a massive collapse that isn't going to happen before we would find ourselves having to pay up, so we might as well keep taking the premiums and enjoy them. They parcelled up credit default swaps into what called credit default obligations, putting them all into the same pot and getting people to invest in them. When the massive worldwide Ponzi scheme started to crash, the banks suddenly realized that those they thought were insuring them simply were unable to pay up. These so-called instruments were weapons of economic mass destruction, amounting to the equivalent of economic nuclear bombs. AIG, the biggest insurance company in the world, found itself on the verge of total collapse because they were unable to meet the obligations, leaving massive debts still sitting on the balance sheets of the banks who thought they had bought insurance against the risk. They thought they had those risks covered. It couldn't possibly go wrong. Their grand scheme was bust. They were left with massive toxic debts. Today, banks across the world still have massive toxic debts sitting on their balance sheets. If I give you an example, think about the story of the Royal Bank of Scotland, RBS. The British taxpayers now own 81% of that crippled bank. It has billions of pounds worth of debts. So guess what it did? It created 2 banks. A good bank and a bad bank. And it shifted something like £46 billion worth of debt into the bad bank and then continued to operate the good bank. And if it gets the good bank up and running okay, then we will sell it back to them. They haven't managed to do that as yet. Billions. What's going to happen to the billions of pounds, you might ask, in the bad bank? Well, don't ask me. I only know it's there. They actually say that this bad bank has been reduced by a few billion pounds. So that set me thinking, how could they, in these economic circumstances, have managed to reduce the debts in the bad bank? Well, house repossessions have rocketed since the financial crash. Since the crash, UK repossessions have amounted to a massive 400,000 homes. That equates to around 9 million men, women, and children losing their homes. This happened with interest rates at 0.5%. How could that possibly happen? In the past few years, people sleeping rough on the streets of London alone has doubled from 4,000 to 8,000 people. That's London alone. In 1981, the average interest rates were 14.16%. 14.16%. Only 4,870 repossessions took place. Contrast that with the thousands of repossessions that have taken place since this economic crash. What has taken place has amounted to a property grab by the banks to recover assets to their balance sheets and then say they are reducing their debtors. The people who were made homeless and thrown on the streets are the very people, through their taxes, who saved the banking and political criminals who caused the crash. Let me give you another hypothetical example. And I've no doubt this happened in reality. Take a couple, maybe 2 children, both of them working. Then along comes this economic crash and the austerity with it, and they both lose their jobs. Now they can no longer finance whatever commitments they may have, in particular, maybe their mortgage. They might have even been paying their mortgage for 10 years. They can't sleep at night because of the stress that's been caused. And then there's a knock on the door. Hypothetically speaking, and it might be a banker from the Royal Bank of Scotland who says you haven't been paying your mortgage, we're going to repossess your home. The very people that these people through their taxes saved. That's what's basically been happening, but on a more massive scale. I've read a few books about the economic crash. And I've read some good books by some good authors. Not one book blames people on benefits for this global economic crash. Every single one of them puts the blame where it really belongs. So much for a few people wrongly claiming benefits being responsible for the biggest ever global economic crash in history. Doesn't stand up to any kind of common sense. But you won't get that from our media. They set out to convince you and me that this so-called benefit scroungers were to blame and not the real criminals. Democracy has been trampled on by the European Union. The people of Cyprus were trampled on. Democracy in Greece, the very home of democracy, was snuffed out when a few years ago they voted against EU austerity. British democracy is being crushed as the referendum means nothing to the European dictatorship of the troika. Did you vote for Jean-Claude Juncker, President of the European Commission since 2014? 4 years he's been there. I didn't vote for him. I didn't even know he was up for election. I would have nominated Arthur. Whoever had chance to vote for Mario Draghi, President of the European Central Bank. Since 2011, he's been there 7 years. A former Goldman Sachs banker. If that doesn't rub salt into the wounds, then I, quite honestly, do not know what does. Then there is Christine Lagarde. Don't know whether you've heard of her. She's the director of the International Monetary Fund. She's been there 7 years as well. I never voted for her. Never got a chance. Lagarde was ranked the 5th most powerful woman in the world by Forbes magazine. The 5th most powerful woman in the world. Never elected. She's been reappointed. She's been reappointed by what they call consensus. Note, not elected. In 2016, for a further 5 years, being the only candidate for the post. Comrades, we have to build a head of steam. And I think this is right that the Socialist Labour Party has this conference and puts itself at the front. We have to build a head of steam which makes the rich pay for their crimes and not the poor. We need to stop and reverse the massive cuts to working class living standards. We need to put money into the pockets of people. We have to demand a minimum wage of at least £15 an hour. We need to vigorously pursue tax avoidance and tax evasion, the biggest scroungers of all. We have to find the courage within ourselves to be socialists. We must put an end to austerity and instead invest in our people in a concerted drive for growth and put our people back to work with decent wages. We must end 0 hours contracts. We have to establish decent, well-funded pension schemes and end the obscenity of people having to go to food banks in order to find the wherewithal to manage. We must not be afraid to make our demands. There must be a massive reversal of the transfer of wealth that has taken place from the poor to the rich. Only in the past few days I was reading a book that said that during the 1990s, the late 1990s, traders working for Solomon Brothers, the bank that collapsed, were receiving bonuses of £8 million a year. We must take the banks into public ownership for good, not just so taxpayers take them over for a short time to save the rich and then hand them back to the banks. We must reject and counter the constant media propaganda that parties of the left are unelectable. They keep saying that. It's like a mantra. But it doesn't fit the reality. In recent times, the people of Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy have voted for left-wing policies. The Labour membership here has expressed a desire to move to the left. And Americans in their thousands voted for Bernie Sanders, a self-proclaimed socialist who was cheated out of the Democratic nomination and who I believe would have gone on to win had he been up against Donald Trump. We have to link up and build alliances with all these anti-austerity forces wherever they may be, and fight to end austerity and advance towards a socialist system of society. Comrades, I will leave you with a quote. A quote from Gillian Tett's book, Fool's Gold. Gillian Tett's no left-winger. In fact, she's the manager of the Financial Times in New York. But it's a good book. I would certainly recommend it. Writing about two of America's largest banks that went bust, Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers. She said they had, and I quote, extensive experience in dealing with mortgage-backed bonds. They prided themselves on running tight risk controls. As they each cranked up their credit default obligations, they realized that the risk was becoming like a toxic byproduct of a chemical experiment or waste from a nuclear reactor. But no solution occurred to them, and they would not switch off the machine. End of quote. That, friends, is it in a nutshell. We are not the criminals, and we should refuse to be blamed or allow our people to be blamed for this economic crash that has crushed nation after nation in the European Union, which serves only to serve and protect the rich and not the poor. We are not the perpetrators of this capitalist crime known as austerity, but we are the victims of it. We must stop negotiating with economic thugs. We have been in the EU too long for any good it may have done. It is time to say goodbye. Not nice to have known you, and leave. Thank you very much.